Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, I'm Liz Fisher, U.S. DOT Federal Highway. Welcome to, this is number five of the NROM series on green infrastructure. And most of all, thank you guys student-wise for being here. Again, not only because you had to, because I think it might actually is an interesting topic. Today we have Randall Wakamoto from City and County of Honolulu, the Department of Facilities and Maintenance, who is kind of the stormwater go-to guy here on Oahu. Whatever you want to know, I'm going to point the fingers and say Randall is it. Randall does have his undergraduate degree from Santa Clara University. He is a professional licensed engineer in the state of Hawaii. This is very important stuff because sometimes you got to get those papers stamped and then they're legal. And somebody else who has a professional license, I would tell you it's really important. So we asked Randall to come and talk story to us today about things that he does in the world with Department of Facilities Management for stormwater as it relates to green infrastructure. So that you guys can see yet another piece of this green infrastructure pie, where and how the natural sciences fits into the bigger picture, and quite honestly, what other professional opportunities you might have by finding out who some of these folks are. So Randall, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming all the way from Kapolei to UH, and the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Liz, for that introduction. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. I know it's at the end of the day, so I just kind of wanted to start. I know Liz had asked if I could do a little introduction and explanation of how, as far as the city's role, because we're a government agency, a local government, and we do have a lot of it has to do with rules, regulations, and of course that's kind of the boring part of everything. But obviously that's the way that, in order for government to enact any type of actions on the public or private sector, we need to establish certain type of rules. So I'll kind of go a little bit into that, but I really didn't want to talk too much into the technical stuff, kind of giving more of a high level overview of how the city goes about handling its stormwater management program, and kind of giving you a little background, and then leading to some kind of maybe some of the things that to think about as young bright minds. And I think that's really key, because what we've been finding is that I think if we can establish it as early as possible to kind of get that mindset, about the importance of stormwater, the environment, things like that, things that are sustainable, that I think that's going to lead towards a better future for both the residents, the businesses, and the people that come to visit us. So again, I just wanted to give a little background on my, like Liz just mentioned. So yes, I do have an engineering degree from Santa Clara University, and only when I sent that sort of my little bio to Liz, I kind of realized I graduated over 20 years ago, and I don't realize how fast it went through. So I've been with the city for about 20 years now. So pretty much started in this program, which is a stormwater management program. So, so what I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about is, so how does that all relate to what we do? So you can see here just an example. This is things that either localized or on a wide scale. And you see it all across the country, but here in Hawaii, of course, it does impact us quite a bit, because we're on an island. We have very short, intense storms. And because of the way things are situated, a lot of that urbanized areas where you work, where you play, where you live, is usually in a lot of that lower areas where all the water is going to come down to. So you're going to see a lot of this happening. And as urbanization keeps increasing, you're going to see more and more of these kind of drainage and flooding situations around the island. Other things that you guys are probably aware of is like sea level rise effects. What you're trying to see is, of course, during this summer, we saw that king tides that were happening. So now water is actually coming up further and up into that areas where we normally never used to see water. And you're also going to see things like where erosion is occurring right along the beach and coastal areas. So that's another issue that we have to address. Of course, other things is because we're on an island also, we're surrounded by water. So we rely on this precious resource either for our, in order to recreate, or in this kind of situation, in order to sustain us as far as for drinking water. And so what does all this have to do with what we do? Well, where we come in is obviously from the city and county of Honolulu. We're a lot of it has to deal with all those issues. And then what the other thing that has to tie into is this water pollution issue. And so this is just an example. What I'm showing here is, you see here where it's an urbanized neighborhood, a lot of the residents, a lot of houses are situated around a lake or pond or whatever it might be. And because this is what happens when it rains, is it's going to wash down everything, and everything's going to collect in one particular area. In this kind of situation is this lake. And so this is something you could say maybe typical, but maybe not as typical, depending on what's happening in that neighborhood. And that's what's going to happen was when it rains, you're going to see all this kind of pollution occurring, where the water is going to start turning murky, very turbid, and it's going to wash off all the other things like pathogens, oils and greases, metals, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and all those kind of things, which affects both the aquatic habitat, the plants that live in it, as well as the people who use it for their recreational purposes. Okay. So what does that have to do with the city? Well, the city itself, the way we kind of explain it is that we're responsible, of course, for anything that has to do with that's owned and operated by the city. So that includes a lot of the assets, what we might say as a sort of like a drainage system. So we might have the roads, we would have the storm drains, all the system, the streams, ditches, catch basins, anything that would capture and collect the water and then get that out to into the ocean. And so the way that we're, in a sense, addressing this issue is through what is referred to as a permit, a stormwater permit. And this is all part of that larger EPA Clean Water Act, in which case the EPA hands over the authority to the various states, and it requires the states to have to implement some type of a program to address water pollution, and it's done through what is referred to as this NPDS, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And so that's a permit that the state goes and issues to the city. And you can see here, the permit was issued recently in the last 2 years, in January of 2015. And the permit is basically a 5-year cycle. So every 5 years, we always have to renew this permit. And what it does is it authorizes the city to discharge pollution into the state's waters. And I'm not saying that we're wanting to discharge pollution, but it's always known that that's something that's going to happen whether we're here or not. It's always going to wash off. Storms are going to push the water. So what this permit does tell us is that by getting this permit, you're authorized to discharge into what is referred to as a state receiving water. So that's like an embayment, a pond, a lake, ocean, beaches, things like that. But what it does say that is that the city needs to implement a program to try to minimize, mitigate, remove whatever pollution to the best that it can do, to the best of its ability, to somehow be able to meet what the state's criteria in terms of what they feel is what is considered to be clean, I guess, or pristine. So that's what it kind of looks like, is that we get this permit and it breaks it down into these 7 various elements. So you can see here, starting from the top, on the left hand, at the top corner here, and on this side here is that, and we'll work it around in a, I guess, in a counterclockwise way. But so it starts with public participation and outreach. So of course, we're working with the public, we're working with volunteers, we're working with various agencies, as well as the public themselves, businesses. And we're trying to educate them on what's going on. And then we move down into construction site runoff control, which is right below it. And that's really what things are starting to go into development. And they're actually starting to urbanize a lot of your neighborhoods. So they're gonna build a house, they're gonna build a shopping center, they're gonna build a high-rise building or whatever it might be. So during that phase of construction is that the city needs to establish a program of how they're gonna try to mitigate and minimize the runoff coming from these construction sites. And then what it does is it moves into this next phase, which is when the time comes and there's an actual discharge. So let's say a contractor is going in, he's putting in, trenching in for utilities or whatever it might be, or maybe he's going and putting in the foundation for some of the houses that they're gonna build. But by doing that, they're disturbing the earth. So they're moving up the soil, they're exposing it to the elements. And so when it rains, of course, it's gonna wash all that out. So the contractors themselves have to follow certain requirements to try to prevent that from happening. But if it does happen, that's where our illicit discharge detection and elimination system is intended to go out and be able to give the city that authority to enforce on a contractor or business, to tell them that they cannot do this. And because of what you've done, you're gonna have to do corrective actions, you're gonna have to clean it up, and at the same time may have to pay a fine. Okay. And when we move into that next one is a monitoring and implementation plan. And so this is what we're talking about, is we're actually trying to assess the condition of the water. We're always continuously collecting samples. We're testing it to see how is it getting better or is it getting worse. And that would be something that we would need to report on an ongoing basis. And we use that as a way to assess how effective our program is, and then we make certain adjustments. So this is sort of an adaptive management process that we have to instill within our program. So we're always not static, we're always dynamic, we're always adjusting things as things change. And then what we do is, in addition to that, we have our industrial and commercial facilities. So those are like businesses, whether it's a restaurant, an auto repair shop, it may be a large industrial facility. So we go out to do inspections to verify that they're actually doing certain things to try to prevent and again, try to minimize that discharge. And then what we're going to talk about primarily for today is this post-construction stormwater management program. And so what that is really is when development is occurring, as things are built, subdivisions are being put in, high rises, so forth, is that there should be some kind of provision for the developer and engineers to come up with ideas of how they're going to treat and capture that water after it's all built. So this is after construction has been done already. So now you have an as-built condition where there's going to probably be a lot of impervious surfaces, whether it's the roof building or it's going to be parking lots or whatever other paved surfaces. So the idea is, of course, when it rains, it's going to wash all that off. But what we'd like to see is something to capture some of that water, treat it before it actually leaves the site. And so that's what that program is. And then lastly, what we just want to emphasize is this pollution prevention, good housekeeping. So that's within the city, mainly within the city, where we have to have programs established to try to prevent and capture that, whatever is coming out of our drain system. So that's where you might see street sweepers. You might see what is referred to as vector trucks, which is big suction, has like a big tank at the back of it. They use these big hoses, they stick it down the drain line and they suck up whatever's inside of it. So that's really to capture a lot of the pollution that's already gone into the system. Okay. So when we talk about that, treating of the water, this is kind of just a real quick overview, is that what we're talking about is when it rains, you're gonna see the rainwater is gonna be flowing onto the surfaces. So whether it's paved or it's concrete or whatever, it might be a roof building. So it's gonna hit that, of course, and because it's impervious, it's just gonna wash it off. So what we like to do is be able to filter that water, whether capturing it either to allow the water to infiltrate or possibly to reuse that water. So actually capturing it and then recycling that water. So you could use it for other purposes, whether for landscaping or for other purposes that you could think of, whether it's like flushing toilets or actually using it to maybe use it for decorative ponds or anything that you could think of what that water could be used for. So that's really the goal of what our program's about. Just looking at ways of how we can treat it, reuse that water and filter it so that way we can prevent that water from being discharged into the ocean. So how do you do some of that? Well, just some examples real quickly is things like infiltration basins, bioretention, green roofs, permeable pavement, cisterns, and vegetated swells. So that's generally not saying that's the only things you can do, but there's a whole suite of things. And there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of studies being done in terms of the effectiveness on that. And that's one of the things that, from a city standpoint, that's kind of the, where we're still continuously learning about how these different systems can benefit, the public, and also for helping the businesses as well as the design community who come up with these plans. Really what we'd like to do is be able to just provide them with the resources, information, maybe some of the research and background in terms of how that information could be applied into their project sites or whatever development plans. And then by doing that, then that kind of becomes part of the overall project rather than something that's just added in at the end just because you have to get a permit. So that's kind of the sort of the change in mindset that we're trying to get out to the public. So when we emphasize low impact development, what we're talking about again is we're trying to infiltrate the water, possibly reuse it, and filtering it, so capturing a lot of that pollutants. And so the reason why we say low impact development or green infrastructure is so important is because if you can see this chart, you see a lot of the ones that are in green on the right-hand side. So here, these are what we would kind of refer to as your, I guess you could say your typical pollution sources. So this is like sediment, things like trash, debris, things that you would probably see from a visual standpoint. But there's a whole suite of different pollutants that could be associated with that runoff. So things like what we're talking about is like things like bacteria or pathogens, could be things like nitrogen or phosphorus. or metals like copper, lead, zinc. And that's what you kind of see in a lot of urbanized areas, is because either you have a lot of vehicles, or you might have a lot of pet waste, or you might have wastewater systems, or anything that could be contributing. But a lot of that you wouldn't actually see in the water. It's not like a real visual thing. It's in the water itself, but you would only be able to know it or detect it if you were to test it and measure it to see what the results are. What you would commonly find is that because of these things, you're going to see some of the end results. Whether you're going to see fish kills, you might see possibly algae blooms, you might see other things where there's going to be associated effects like odor that's coming out of the water or something, or you might get ill because by getting in contact with that water. So it's sort of like these downstream consequences, but you wouldn't obviously see in the water directly. So what we emphasize with low impact development, the reason why it's so important is because it actually targets a lot more of these associated pollutants that you wouldn't typically see in the water by just looking at it from a visual standpoint. And where you see these low impact developments is it's much more effective of capturing each one of these type of pollutant sources, versus if you go with a more traditional thing where you're just filtering and capturing the big stuff. That's where you might capture some of the trash, some of the debris, but it's not going to be as effective in terms of removing something like nitrogen or phosphorus. And that's where that low impact development, because you're trying to get it into the ground, use the plants and the soils to uptake a lot of that nutrients and metals. So that's where you see that effectiveness come into play. Okay, so what we see here as a city, of course, we're not the ones actually coming up with this. This is a lot of it is development. So developers are coming in, proposing subdivisions. They might be coming in for plans to go and build in a new commercial development center or whatever it might be. So they come in with their plans, of course, and what they're proposing is, of course, to follow whatever design standards that the city has. And so this is a typical one that you would commonly find, and this is something right outside our building in Kapolei. So you see, of course, you see here, of course, the roadway, the travel way, and then what you see is curbing on both sides of the streets. So you're going to see both. There might be a median strip, like in this situation here, we have a median strip where it might be vegetated. So I mean, that's pretty good, but it's going to be curbed because the reason why is because they want to capture whatever water hits the surface, and they're going to channel it into what is referred to as a catch basin. So this is like an opening in the curb. And what it has is a box that captures the water and it pipes it underground, and it's going to eventually discharge out into the ocean. So this is a typical of what we're seeing. And it's mainly because of course, what the existing standards are that the developers are following as well as the engineers. And then this is what's happening in a lot of parts of the world as well as in the country, especially in places like Portland, California, New York. And this is an example of all places, it's Nashville, Tennessee. So you can see just an example of what we refer to as green infrastructure. So what we're talking about is more green type of streetscaping. So you can see that they have a lot of planter strips here. In the median strip, they're actually creating these what they refer to as like a biofiltration or rain garden. So they're actually channelizing the water. Instead of it going directly into like a box and then being piped, it actually will go through this vegetated area. It's sort of like a buffer area. What's coming off the land, off the streetscape, and then putting it into this landscaping area before it actually gets into some type of an inlet or catch basin. And so it provides some of that filtration mechanism before the water actually leaves. And so this is something that we like to establish, but obviously we would have to have a sort of ongoing discussions with the development community as well as the engineering community. So how do we make that change? And that's pretty tough because of course of all what's existing right now. And this is sort of just using what the existing standards, and of course it would kind of take a substantial effort to make that change. But that's something I think we're trying to looking towards as a city agency to provide that kind of resource so that it could help like a design community to actually implement some of this. So this is another example, something of a typical urban building division design, I guess you could say. So this is like a townhouse complex or an apartment type of complex. So of course you see a lot of, this is a newer one that's here also in Kapolei, but you can see they do have some landscaping. Of course it's dominated by these buildings. So you're gonna have the roof, they might have PV systems on it, which is great, but all that water is just gonna be captured and it's gonna be piped or put into what they might have is these inlets located throughout the property. So in most cases, they're not really capturing and treating that water, but rather just trying to capture it as quickly as possible and push it off the site. So what we like to do, of course, is from a more urban design is trying to incorporate more of that green ideas or concepts into the building itself. So not just being something where you're looking at it in terms of, well, we add in this landscaping primarily just to function as for an aesthetic purpose, but rather using it as a resource and capturing the water to use it so that you could actually benefit something like whether it's helping to benefit for that urban heat effect, or maybe it's for water quality purposes. You're trying to filter the water. So you can see here something like here in Honolulu, just a couple examples, but you see here in the top is the Honolulu Civic Center. And I don't know if that was really the intent, but that's the way we look at it, is that you see here, there's a roof, of course. This is a roof that's all landscaped, but underneath it is a parking lot. You know, that's where all the public, the city employees all park underneath it. So that kind of serves as almost like as a green roof, as you can see, is that it's actually capturing the water. Other examples are like you see here on the right-hand side is Turtle Bay Resort, is that they're actually starting to, same thing, using some parts of their building to capture and use that water. And they actually incorporate that into the building design. Here, I just threw this one also in, is this Chicago City Hall. So you can see an example of an actual green roof where they turn it into something like a gathering area. And then at the same time, they're adding all this, this landscaping to kind of beautify it, but it also helps to cool down the building. It also uses it to capture the water. So it's just some ideas. Of course, there's a lot of design that goes into it because now you're adding a lot of this load to the building itself. So they have to go and, you know, that's something that's going to have to be designed up front. It's not something that they just add in at the end saying, let's just go and put all this planting on there, because now when it rains, of course, you're going to absorb all that water. So now you're adding all this weight to the building itself. So that's something that they have to take into consideration. Okay, so what is it going to take? So, you know, I guess what you can say is that it probably is a paradigm shift, both from the development community as well as from the engineering side. It's really thinking that there's going to be changes going on. And this is something that, you know, I think more commonly, and maybe I was kind of guilty of this first in the beginning when I was working in the private sector, is kind of putting your head and just not wanting to worry about it. Just say, it will happen sometime in the future. I don't want to worry about this because this is just going to affect my schedules, my budget, whatever designs that I'm going to have to do. So obviously, I think, you know, what we like to do is have that ongoing discussion of how we're going to make that paradigm shift, to think about, rather than trying to get the water as quickly as possible off the site, but now you're trying to capture it and use it for other purposes. And so you're treating it more as a resource, and you're looking at it as a benefit rather than as a hindrance to your design. So what are some of those keys to success? Of course, and like I mentioned, there has to be this ongoing collaboration and teamwork. Is really this discussion between both the government, the planning community, the design community, you folks as researchers, and also as the up and coming minds of how we could implement some of these things. You know, that's where we really want to see what is it that we can do that would help both on the long-term sustainability, both from a water quality standpoint, a cost standpoint, an O&M process, things like that. That's where really it's something that has to be implemented at some point in time, but it's going to require everybody coming to the table and really being open to some of these changes. So when it comes to the city, you know, it's not something that we can necessarily, the way that we have to do it is through, a lot of it is through rules. You know, in order to enact any type of change, we can't just go out to the design community and say, hey, you're going to do this, because of course they're going to say, well, that adds cost to our project. It's going to delay our schedules. So we just can't do all of this. And so they're never going to try to implement it. But the only way you can do it is through rules. And so by establishing certain rules, it requires them to have to do something at the time when they apply for whatever permits. You know, so whenever you come in for your grading, building, stockpiling, whatever type of permits that affects development, this is the opportunity that the city has. And so at that time, that's when they're going to talk to the developer, engineer, architect, whoever it might be, and saying, because of these rules, there are certain things that you need to implement within your project. How you go about doing it, that's up to you, but we provide you certain guidance and technical standards. And so what the city did was recently, you could see here, is that we had adopted and made effective recently in August of this year, new rules. And what those rules are is essentially to cover both, I mentioned the construction part. So this is where the contractors are actually building things, as well as the post-construction. So this is after development has occurred. What are they going to do as far as treating and filtering that water. And so what the city did was they adopted these new rules relating to water quality. And in those rules, it basically explains and outlines what the steps that a developer, a contractor, or a designer would need to follow in terms of whatever projects that you're building. Okay? And the way that it's, this is really a synopsis, but just the idea of how we go about implementing it and what we provide guidance to the development community is that for all projects that, whether you're coming in for a building or grading permit, does require some consideration if you have some type of land disturbing activity. So if you're going to disturb the ground, then likely you're going to have to come in for some kind of permit, whether it's a grading or building permit. But at that time, what you're going to be doing is following this process to identify what it is that we need to design for each of our projects. So it starts on from the left-hand side and it works its way to the right. So what you see here is trying to incorporate a lot of that low impact development or LID site design strategy. So that would be for any project that comes in that qualifies for under those rules. And what they would do is start incorporating some of those site design strategies. And then from there, they would look at it from a source control standpoint as far as what are the activities that are going to take place on my site and try to come up with ways of how we're going to mitigate that. And then as they go through the development of that project and start getting further into the design, then they'll start looking at more treatment mechanisms. So this is where you'll think about things like infiltration, reuse, biofiltration, using plants to uptake a lot of the nutrients and metals. And then lastly, you might be using something like an alternative compliance, which is more like you're trying to use somewhat of these manufactured units, which is not really the most effective, but yet it does provide some treatment. And this is just really a flow chart that just kind of summarizes really what that process of a designer or developer would need to follow. So of course they come in with their project, they identify if in fact we need to incorporate, which is pretty much for all projects, they have to incorporate some kind of LID site design strategy. And so at that time, once they did identify that, then the next step would be to identify what those source controls. And if it does fall within certain type of categories, then they would start looking at other type of treatment mechanisms, whether to retain or reuse the water or to actually biofiltrate. So this is where they would start thinking about, if we're not able to do this, then we go to the next step. And we try to figure out how we can incorporate that into our project. And if you cannot do that, then you would go to the next step. And so it's really a process that they have to follow to try to get it to the point where they're actually treating the water as much as possible to the most effective way that they can capture that water. So what are some of that site planning processes that a designer would need to follow? So first thing they would need to do, as I mentioned, they would need to identify what those potential sources. So what is the project really intended for? Are they going to be building like a commercial building where there's going to be loading docks? Is there going to be fueling going on? Are they going to be doing any kind of washing of equipment? Is there going to be parking lots as well as any kind of equipment storage? So these are all the potential sources of where that pollution might be coming from. So any designer is going to start thinking about what is it that we're designing, figuring out what is the actual source. And then from there, it would kind of tell them, how are we going to kind of capture that water and treat it before it actually leaves the site? So that's where you would start thinking about, once you've identified the source, what is those pollutants of concern? So are we targeting oil and grease? Are we targeting metals, nitrogen, phosphorus? These are all the things that's associated with the various different type of activities. And of course, the more heavier industrial type activities, the more significant or more, I guess, more severe type of pollutants you could encounter. And so you're gonna have to think about what exactly are you designing these treatment mechanisms. So of course you wouldn't wanna put something, if you know you're a heavy industrial facility that's gonna be dealing with certain type of toxic chemicals or other type of things that could be very hazardous to health. You're not gonna try to come up with a plan to treat the water by putting it down into the ground and then put it into the groundwater, because of course you're gonna start affecting that groundwater recharge. So of course you're gonna have to look at ways of how you're gonna capture that, treat it, so that you're not gonna be affecting someone who might be either working in that area or living in that area. So you gotta think about what it is that you're targeting and then come up with the best way to try to address those pollutant sources. So what are some of those ways is really trying to identify where is the your existing area. And what we try to encourage is trying to, of course, emphasize the infiltration of water. So try preserving a lot of that natural areas, whether it's soils and vegetation. The more they disturb it, of course, the more chances that you're gonna be encountering different type of pollutants. But if you can conserve a lot of that area and then try to direct the water into those, that's where you can get a lot of that infiltration to occur. But in most cases, we can see in urban Honolulu is that wall to wall, you're gonna have a building. And so they pretty much have no space to really create any of this existing vegetation because they're gonna go all the way almost up to the sidewalk. And then on the other side, they're gonna have another sidewalk and then they're gonna build it right up to it as well. And in between all of that, they're gonna have a large parking structure. So now you kind of minimize the chances for doing a lot of these things. So that's really at the early stages of planning that they have to start thinking about that. Where can they create these pockets? Maybe they can preserve some of that existing vegetation, try to minimize some of that impervious surfaces and use it as a common area, maybe as a park, or maybe as an area where it could be like a walking pathway or something, or maybe even use it as a decorative feature of the actual property, where you're directing water to go into a certain area and it becomes like sort of like a decorative pond or something. I don't know. Just kind of thinking about different ways of how they could use that. So it's really trying to come up with creative ideas of how to manage the water on your site. And of course, other things like we just mentioned earlier was looking at some of those source controls. So I won't really go through each one of them, but of course, just identifying where the water could come into contact, and that could be a source for any type of pollution. The way that the rules have kind of outlined this, and I just will real briefly, is it's really based on both volume as well as the flow that you're going to encounter. So the idea is if, as far as how the city is concerned, is that we're targeting this, what is referred to as a 1-inch storm event. And this is kind of sort of tied into that first flush, you know, so if you've never heard about that, and it's sort of, I mean, it's still kind of being debated in terms of how effective it is. But the idea is that when that first initial flush, you get that rainfall that first occurs, and maybe there's a long period of dry weather during that, before that. But at initial one, you're gonna see this huge spike in whatever it might be, whether it's sediment or nitrogen or metals or whatever it is, because it's washing everything off the surface. And as the water keeps flowing, as the rain keeps continuing, it's gonna kind of get this dilution effect. So then you're gonna start seeing this tapering of that concentration. So the idea is that we target that first inch of rainfall, then you're gonna be able to capture at least that initial flush of water. So when we look at it and mapping out over a period of, let's say, what was that, 50 or 60 years, you're gonna see that if you were to look at all the average annual storm events that have occurred over that time period, and if we were to kind of map it out to base it on a chart to say that what is the percentage of that 1 inch of rainfall, you would see that it would capture about 85% of those rainfall events that have occurred over a historical long period of time. And that's what we were really trying to capture is, of course, as you design storm events to be bigger and bigger, your treatment mechanism is going to get bigger and bigger, but that results in higher costs, of course. So the idea is try to find that sort of that medium. So we're capturing some of the average, the majority of the storm events on an 85 percentile range, and still being able to treat the water to a certain degree that it wouldn't have a huge effect on the cost of development. And that's what we're trying to find and trying to get that sort of to that point. So what are some of the examples that we see here in the city? So you can see here, there's a police station that was redesigned because of the parking lot that was starting to crumble and it would need it to be replaced. So instead of it being directed, the runoff from the parking surface directly into what you see here at the bottom, which is an inlet, is you're actually trying to capture the water, direct it into like a landscaping feature, use the plants, the soils to uptake a lot of that, whatever is coming off the parking surface, and then eventually the water will enter into this inlet. So that's just one example. And you can see here in another example here, this is at the Honolulu Zoo parking lot. So they kind of create like a depression area. Of course, they have to kind of give up 1 stall or 2 stalls possibly, but using it as a dedicated area to allow the water coming off the landscape area and then directing it into this vegetative feature. Other systems are like your vegetated swells, and this is pretty common. Is same thing, either off of a roadway. You can see here, there's a roadway ditch. So whatever comes off the road is going to enter into this ditch, which is lined with vegetation and grass. And the same thing here at the, this is at the Waikiki Shell parking lot. So this one here, you can see that what the water is being directed into these landscape features. And then of course they have these inlets. So that's really to capture that high flow event. So when the time comes when you get this big rain event, it's not going to start flooding the surrounding properties, but rather it will allow the water to still drain, but it will still have some of that ability to capture and filter the water. Okay, this is just another, this is more from a homeowner standpoint, but rain barrels or cisterns. So this is when we start getting into that conversation about reusing of the water. So this is where you might be directing your roof downspouts into an actual location to capture the water. And then you could use it for other purposes, whether for landscaping or for whatever else that you could think of. Okay. And then what we're starting to see now is a lot more of these permeable pavers. So this is within a parking lot or a paved area. So they're adding in these either grass pavers, or you're gonna see these kind of like these blocks. And what it's doing is it's still allowing people to park on it and still be able to use vehicles along that area and still park and drive on it. But what it does is it creates these little void spaces in between to allow the water to filter down below it. So you're still allowing filtering, but in a kind of like on a hardscape area. Okay. And the same thing here, again, we have another park, a police station. So again, when they reconstructed this or relocated this Waianae police station, as part of the design is they incorporated what is referred to as this porous pavement. So it's the same thing. It looks just like concrete. It looks like asphalt, but it has a little bit more granular feel to it. And what they do is they lay it down, of course, and then it's not something that they're going to compact at a really high rate like how they would from like an asphalt standpoint or concrete or anything like that. What they're doing is it's allowing it, there's a lot of pores built into the actual asphalt itself, and that water can actually filter directly down through it. You know, so it just provides some ability to absorb that water into its subsurface. You know, so this is just something, again, another idea. This, you know, this is where that technology, as they're developing these new systems and ways of how to capture and reuse or filter the water, this is what we're kind of looking towards. So just some resources to provide. So the city's Department of Planning and Permitting is the agency here in the city and county of Honolulu that issues all those building grading permits, like I mentioned. And they have all their resources on their website. So you can see here on their honoluludpp.org website. If you were to kind of go to this where it has this applications and forms, there's going to be a drop-down menu where it says stormwater quality. So once you kind of go into here, this applications and forms, there will be a drop-down menu. And you can actually get all this information in terms of, again, going back to the development community, the design community. They provide all these forms, they provide the rules, all the technical background on what's needed in order to come up with whatever processes that they want to do for their particular site. And the same thing occurs here on our Department of Facility. So this is our website with the Stormwater Quality branch. So you can see here, we kind of link up to the Department of Planning and Permitting's website, and it's all referred to as what is the rules relating to water quality. So if you were to click on this tab here, it will direct you to this page, and then you can get all the same information that DPP would have. In addition, we also have some other things like flyers. So we kind of do a lot of the outreach, you know, helping out this Department of Planning and Permitting by providing these flyers, brochures, technical manuals, and resources that anybody could use to help them kind of get a better understanding of what should be done. Okay. Other things that we've kind of done on our website is we've also provided resources in terms of how to get information, more information about low impact development. So just what I've been talking about, low impact development, green infrastructure. So if you kind of go to our website, you click on this Learning Center tab, and then you go all the way to the bottom here, there's a section here that we devoted to post-construction. And so that's where we put a lot of information, and they might even include some of our presentations, our PowerPoint presentations that we've done to the various, whether it's to the planning association, architectural associations, engineering community. We put a lot of that information on our website just so that people are more aware of what's going on. Okay. And then this is another resource that we use as well. So you can see there's a lot of information out there, and it's either coming from EPA or the Landscape Architects Association or the Sustainable Cities Institute. So on these websites, what they do is a lot of these case studies, and which we really like is the idea is that they're kind of comparing what is the benefit of implementing this green infrastructure as opposed to something what they call more like a gray infrastructure. So you're talking about concrete, asphalt, pipes, roadways, So if you were, of course, that's the traditional design. So this is where you're trying to just get the water as quickly off, but then of course it supports having all the traffic and all the vehicles and equipment to be able to get to wherever they need to get to. But by incorporating some of this green infrastructure, you start adding in some of that additional features. But the concern a lot from the design and the development community is it's going to cost a lot of money. And really, is it providing any of that benefit that you could see? Because a lot of the argument could be made that, yeah, we do all of this, but yet the lake or stream or whatever is right there is still polluted. I haven't seen any difference because of what we did. And yet we spent all this money to do all these things, and yet we haven't seen some of that direct benefits. And I think what these studies have shown is that there is that linkage, and there is that benefit that you're seeing, and they're trying to demonstrate that by incorporating some of this green infrastructure, you could actually lower your overall cost of your project. And it could actually even result in getting more benefits, like whether it's aesthetic, the heat, urban environment, even air pollution. You know, there's all these other things that it provides the benefits for that they've measured and studied by incorporating some of this green infrastructure. So I think that's really, we use a lot of that information to help us to kind of encourage or try to get developers and engineers to really adopt this idea of what really green infrastructure could be done for. So what are some of those next steps? And I think what we like to do is be able to continue to collaborate with a lot of the research partners. Actually, we have an ongoing, well, we're still kind of working it through the University of Hawaii. We're trying to work through the College of Engineering. And what we like to do is be able to come up with this idea of, if we were to monitor some of these green infrastructure or low impact development designs, demonstrate that it is actually effective both from a cost standpoint as well as a water quality standpoint, and then use that information to be able to develop what would be, you know, what the city tends to come up with is these design standards. And this is what the design community is relying on, you know, because of course, not saying that they don't want to come up with something new, but they just don't want to reinvent the wheel. So they're kind of looking towards the government to come up with these design standards, and then we can just put it into our projects. You know, so if you've done the studies, you've looked at it, you see that this is what the city would support, we're going to add that into our design. And that's currently that's what's happening right now, is they're putting it into their design, but they're using the current design standards. But the current design standards doesn't support any of this green stuff. It's about going all the way back to that curb, gutter, storm drains, catch basins, you know, everything's all paved from sidewalk to sidewalk. So that's the current standard. So that's why there's this movement to try to incorporate more of that green infrastructure. Other things we got to look at is identifying funding opportunities. And again, this is because this whole idea that by adding in this green infrastructure is going to cost, it's going to drive the cost for construction as well as the cost for your cost of living to go up, because somebody's going to have to pay for all of this. And I do recognize, yes, that is a concern, and that's something that we have to kind of look at from a practical standpoint, but there still should be other opportunities that we can find. Not saying that, you know, really trying to, there's ways that we can do it, and we've seen it across the country, you know, whether they establish certain fees or they come up with a way to collect, fees or permits or whatever it might be from the from the either the people who live in that area or whoever works in that area, you know, the businesses, and then using it to be dedicated towards the long-term operations and maintenance of a lot of these systems. So that's something that we're currently looking at, and it's something that we're concerned about, because if we were to do some of these things, it definitely wouldn't become sustainable, in which case we might end up building it and it's just going to fail because nobody's maintaining it. And that's the worst fear that we would want to see. And then lastly, we'd like to provide, you know, this ongoing training and outreach component to just kind of get folks to be more embracing of this idea or this concept. And so it's not somewhat of a hurdle. You know, there's still that kind of resistance for change, you know, because of course they're concerned about the cost, and they're kind of built into that mindset of how they've traditionally done things. And so this is sort of that shift that's going on. And so we'd like to continue with that ongoing outreach and trying to train and educate those that are involved in this process. And then maybe we can kind of come up with something that could satisfy both the design side of it, as well as, of course, from a regulator standpoint, as well as from a environmentalist standpoint. So trying to get that happy medium again. So that's pretty much my presentation. I just want to thank you again for sitting through that. If there's any questions that you guys have, I'm more than welcome to address anything.
Okay. Questions? So obviously you can't rebuild things that are in good condition. It takes time for when the opportunity arises to have that construction change. But what would be like a really rough estimate of when you think Hawaii could start having goals of turning over to be like a city like Portland or places that have a like majority green infrastructure?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was that when does the city see that sort of that shift or change of where, following some of the other municipalities of adopting this green infrastructure as part of the regular designs, we could see that happening. I think it's actually starting to happen now because, and the problem is like, the problem we have is that you have that sort of as-built condition. So whatever is there now, it's pretty difficult for us to come back and redevelop it. Tear down the structures, rebuild everything, and start from scratch. So but the current way that we've addressed it is through, again, talking through that rules that I've talked about, the rules related to water quality, and that affects any new development or redevelopment. So this is when somebody has to come in for their permit, whether they want to build a new subdivision. So for instance, those that are coming in is like that Coal Ridge development. There's another one that's going to be coming out in Eva as well as in Kapolei. But as part of those designs, they need to address these rules, in which case they're going to start thinking about how do we incorporate some of these green infrastructure within the existing design. So at the time when they're actually going to go out to construction, that's already part of the design and it's already been taken care of. There's still going to be some ongoing discussions, of course, of who's going to be responsible for maintaining it. But I think that's the way that we can see how we can address it. In terms of for whatever is currently in place, so that would be considered like a redevelopment. So we can see it in sort of pockets or in parcels. So like one of the opportunities that we probably missed is like the Ala Moana Shopping Center. When they basically tore it down, they rebuilt the whole wing of that. So that would have had to be addressed via these rules if in fact that project came in during this year. But that project was before that. So they were sort of in a way exempted or kind of grandfathered under the old rules. So I think by establishing these new rules, whenever those kind of situations come up where they're going to redevelop a parcel, they would need to incorporate some of these designs as part of their overall project. We're still working within the city as far as how we would try to address it as far as the existing infrastructure. So we're talking about roadways, whatever is there within the sidewalks, so this is like the right of way. So that's a little bit more challenging because you're kind of working in a kind of a confined area and there's not a lot of space, especially if it's already kind of been built. And it's not like we're looking to add another lane or something or widen the roads or even creating other spaces. And there's all other kind of features being added in at the same time. So that's some of the challenge because they're trying to put in the bike lanes now. So they're trying to adopt this whole complete streets model. And so that complete streets model does incorporate some ideas of adding in green infrastructure. But obviously it's going to take a part from the design community as well as the government to want to embrace that. Because some things might take precedence over others. So instead, they may say, no, let's go and put in street parking as well as maybe a travel way for bike lanes, but now we don't have any space for any kind of landscaping features, because of that issue. So what takes precedence? It all kind of comes down to whoever is making those decisions. And so that's why we're trying to come in, adding in this component, and at least at a minimum, it should be a consideration. But what we're hoping for is at some point, it's going to become a mandatory requirement. But I think that's down the road, kind of in the future.
If I may, following up on that, I know we're out of time, but I have a question for you. With the City and County's Office of Sustainability and Josh and his team,
right,
that would open up opportunity, I would think, for you guys, the Complete Streets team, the transit-oriented development, just for that infrastructure community alone to start having a better, healthy, holistic conversation and proactive discussion. Are you seeing that happen yet with that new team?
Yeah, actually, well, so the question was that, are we starting to see some of that conversations occurring within the city, especially with the new Office of Sustainability, having transit-oriented development? So yes, to answer that question, we've already been, so actually Josh has been very active. He's already reached out to us. We're really trying to sit down with him. We're trying to kind of create like a sort of like this, in a sense, maybe like a stakeholder group that would involve folks from TOD, the Transit-Oriented Development, as well as the Department of Planning and Permitting, who issue a lot of the grading building permits. And then of course you have your Department of Transportation Services, who oversee a lot of that complete streets model. So we've had some of that initial conversations, maybe on an individual basis, but what we like to do is try to get them all together so that we could start thinking about, like what we just mentioned, is creating certain design standards that could help the developers, engineers to come up with ideas of how they're going to incorporate that as part of their overall project. But I think right now they're kind of taking these incremental steps, and a lot of it has to do with funding. So they're addressing some of it, but not really looking at the big overall, because it's kind of hindered by the funding that's right now currently available.
Thank you very much.